It was a small town tucked into the woods of northern Minnesota, the kind that kept to itself, where everyone knew everyone. Legend said the forest had a history, something dark that refused to stay buried. Growing up, locals heard tales of strange disappearances, eerie shadows lurking in the trees, but everyone brushed it off as ghost stories. Until the night the Latimer family vanished. The Latimers were quiet, modest people, known more for their reclusive nature than anything else. They'd only moved to town 2 years ago, buying a ramshackle cabin at the edge of the forest. No one thought much of it until they stopped showing up around town. Months passed, and the cabin grew more derelict, the windows fogged with grime, the front steps sinking deeper into the earth. Teenagers would dare each other to approach it at night, but most would chicken out halfway through the forest path. The only witness, if it could be called that, was an old man named Jonas, who'd lived in town for nearly 80 years. When anyone asked him what he thought happened to the Latimers, his answer was always the same. They found something that didn't want to be found. It wasn't long before strange things began to happen. On misty mornings, people swore they could hear a woman's laughter echoing from the direction of the cabin, though no one had lived there for over a year. Some townsfolk said it was just birds, others claimed it was the wind catching in the hollows of the forest. But anyone who passed near the cabin felt something, a bone-chilling cold, like an invisible hand tracing a line down their spine. One night, a group of friends, 4 of them, decided they'd had enough of the rumors. They wanted proof of what was really going on. They made a pact to stay in the cabin overnight to find out if the stories were true or just the products of bored minds. They met in the town square, armed with flashlights, a few sleeping bags, and a resolve none of them truly felt. There was Maddie, the ringleader, with her brazen attitude and desperate need to prove herself. Ben, her boyfriend, who didn't really believe in the stories but didn't want to leave her alone. Greg, the quiet one, who often saw things others missed. And Lucy, the skeptic, who thought this was all a waste of time. The walk through the woods was unsettling in its silence. No sounds of night creatures, not even the rustling of leaves. It was as if the forest itself held its breath, watching. When they arrived at the cabin, they were surprised to find the front door slightly ajar, creaking softly as if inviting them in. As they stepped inside, an unnatural cold settled over them, so chilling that they could see their breath cloud in the air. Maddie joked that the place could use a heater, but no one laughed. The cabin was nothing like they'd imagined. The walls were peeling, moldy, yet every piece of furniture looked meticulously placed, as though someone had taken the time to arrange everything just so. There was an old armchair facing a fireplace filled with ash, as if someone had left mid-conversation and intended to come right back. On the table, an ancient-looking book sat open, its pages filled with strange symbols none of them could read. Lucy dared them to open it, and Maddie, never one to back down, obliged. The moment she touched the cover, a shiver coursed through the room, extinguishing their flashlights in a synchronized flicker. In the ensuing darkness, a faint light began to emanate from the book itself, casting a ghostly glow across their faces. The symbols on the pages shifted and writhed like something alive, twisting into a language none of them recognized but somehow understood. Words like sacrifice and binding floated up at them, the meanings unsettlingly clear. Greg muttered something about leaving, but Maddie was already transfixed, her eyes glued to the book as if something held her in place. A sudden knock came at the door, loud and insistent, snapping them out of their trance. They stared at each other, all their previous bravado vanishing in the face of this new terror. Ben moved to open the door, expecting another teenager from town, maybe someone playing a prank. But when he pulled the door open, no one stood outside. Instead, a thick mist crept into the cabin, swirling around their legs, heavy with the scent of decay. Then they heard it, the faint sound of footsteps above them, slow, deliberate, like someone dragging themselves across the floorboards. The cabin had only one story. Lucy, the skeptic, looked at Maddie with wide, terrified eyes. "We need to leave. Now." They scrambled to gather their things, but as they turned to go, they realized the door had closed behind them, and it wouldn't budge. Ben threw his weight against it, panic making his movements frantic, but it was as though an unseen force held it shut. The footsteps from above grew louder, and with each step, a shadow passed across the room. darker than night, stretching and contorting as though it belonged to something twisted and unnatural. Maddie clutched the book to her chest, trying to shut it, but the pages wouldn't close. They fluttered open, revealing more symbols that seemed to pulse with a heartbeat of their own. Greg began chanting under his breath, words he didn't understand, feeling compelled by some ancient instinct, and the shadow seemed to pause, shifting its attention to him. In an instant, a freezing gust swept through the cabin, and the shadow descended, wrapping itself around Greg's, his face contorted in terror. His screams were cut short, leaving only silence. They could see his figure inside the shadow, struggling, his face contorting as though something was draining the life out of him. Maddie lunged forward to help, but the shadow lashed out, tossing her across the room. Ben grabbed Lucy's hand, desperately trying to pull her toward the window, which had miraculously opened. Together, they squeezed through, tumbling out onto the wet ground, panting and shaking. They looked back in time to see the cabin's walls heaving as if breathing, the windows darkened by something pressing against the glass from within. Without looking back, Ben and Lucy ran. Branches snagged their clothes, roots tripped them, but they kept going until they saw the lights of the town in the distance. By the time they stumbled onto Main Street, they were half mad, screaming about the shadows, the cabin, and the book. But when the townsfolk returned with them to investigate, they found nothing but an empty, rotting structure. There was no sign of Maddie, Greg, or the strange book, only a faint chill in the air and the lingering scent of decay. The townsfolk warned them to never speak of what happened, to let the forest keep its secrets. And for years they did, until new families moved in and the whispers began again of strange laughter in the woods, shadows that watched from the trees, and footsteps that seemed to follow, waiting for the next ones, brave enough or foolish enough to come looking. The summer was supposed to be a chance to reconnect. Jamie, Kelly, and their younger brother Mark hadn't spent time together in years. After their father passed away, their mother inherited his family's old hunting lodge deep in the Appalachian Mountains. No cell reception, no neighbors for miles, just the endless forest stretching around them. It was the perfect escape, or so they thought. The lodge itself was massive and ancient, built by their great-great-grandfather from logs the size of tree trunks. Inside, the furniture was covered in dusty sheets, and the air felt thick and stale. Each room was darkened by heavy, moth-eaten drapes, giving the place an eerie, timeless quality. They spent their first evening unpacking, dusting, and airing out the rooms. By nightfall, they were exhausted and settled around the lodge's massive stone fireplace. It was then that Jamie noticed the markings carved into the stonework above the fireplace. Strange, spiral-like symbols she didn't recognize, sharp and precise, dug deep into the rock. "What do you think these are?" she asked, running her fingers over them. Kelly shrugged, laughing it off, but Mark, the youngest and most impressionable, seemed disturbed. He pointed out how the symbols were repeated on the wooden beams, the door frames, even around the windowsills. As they explored, they realized the symbols covered almost every surface in the lodge. But why? That night, they went to bed with an uneasy feeling. The silence was oppressive, swallowing every creak and whisper. Around midnight, Jamie jolted awake. At first, she wasn't sure why, but then she heard it, slow, dragging footsteps in the hallway outside her room. She lay frozen, listening. She knew it couldn't be Kelly or Mark. The sounds were far too heavy, like someone twice their size. She waited, holding her breath until the footsteps stopped outside her door. There was a long pause, and then the handle began to turn slowly, as if someone were testing it. She wanted to scream, but fear held her in place. The door didn't open. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved away. The next morning, Jamie mentioned it to Kelly and Mark, but they brushed it off as a bad dream. Kelly teased her, saying that the symbols had probably gotten into her head. But Jamie was certain that what she'd heard wasn't a dream. Mark seemed nervous too, admitting that he'd heard whispering outside his door, though he'd convinced himself it was just the wind. As the days went by, stranger things began to happen. Objects would disappear, only to turn up in odd places. The front door, which they always kept locked, would swing open in the middle of the night. One morning, Kelly woke up to find scratches on her forearms, thin and shallow, but unmistakable. She couldn't remember how she'd gotten them, and neither of her siblings could explain it. On the fourth night, Jamie decided to set up an old camcorder they found in the attic to record the hallway. She positioned it just outside their rooms, hoping to catch whatever was lurking in the shadows. That night, as she lay awake, she heard the footsteps again, closer this time, accompanied by a soft whispering, as if someone were reciting an ancient incantation. The following morning, they eagerly checked the footage. At first, everything appeared normal. The hallway was empty, the light flickering slightly, but then around 3:15 a.m., the video captured something strange. A figure appeared at the end of the hallway, tall and cloaked in shadow, its face obscured. It stood there, perfectly still, for several minutes, just watching. Then it began to move down the hallway, its head tilted as if listening for something. As it neared the camera, they could see it had no eyes, just hollow, dark sockets that seemed to pull in the light around it. Suddenly, it turned its head toward the camera, and for a split second, they thought it could see them. The figure's mouth twisted into a grin, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. Then, in a blink, it was gone, vanishing into thin air. They sat in stunned silence, watching the screen as the hallway remained empty. Terrified, they decided to leave, grabbing only the essentials. But as they tried to exit, the front door wouldn't open, no matter how hard they pulled. The windows were locked tight, as though someone or something was trapping them inside. Panic set in. Mark tried smashing a window, but the glass wouldn't even crack. Night fell, and they barricaded themselves in one of the bedrooms, the camcorder set up to face the door. They didn't sleep, too afraid of what might happen if they closed their eyes. Hours ticked by in silence, each second stretching into eternity. Around midnight, the whispering started again, but this time it was louder, coming from just outside the door. Jamie could feel her skin crawl as she listened, every word seeming to burrow into her mind. Then came the footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing through the room as if the figure were pacing outside, waiting. The camcorder captured it all, the door handle twisting, the door shaking as something tried to force its way inside. Finally, with a sickening crack, the door began to splinter, and they watched in horror as a pale skeletal hand reached through the gap, clawing at the air. In a desperate act, Kelly screamed at the figure, shouting that they weren't afraid, that they wouldn't let it control them. For a moment, everything stopped. The hand froze, the whispering ceased, and the figure retreated from the door. Silence fell once more. Just as they thought it was over, the entire lodge began to shake, as though some great force was tearing it apart from within. The walls pulsed, the symbols glowing with a strange, unearthly light, and the air filled with the stench of rot and decay. They could feel something beneath the floorboards, a rumbling as if something ancient and malevolent was stirring from a long sleep. With a final, desperate push, Jamie threw herself at the front door, and this time it gave way, bursting open to the night air. The three of them ran, stumbling through the forest, not daring to look back. They didn't stop until they reached the nearest town, miles away, their clothes torn, their faces streaked with tears. When they told their story, the locals gave them grim looks, warning them that the lodge had a history. 100 years ago, a group of occultists had built it to serve as a gateway, a place to summon ancient forces they barely understood. Many had vanished in the lodge, and those who survived never returned the same. Some said it was cursed, others claimed it was haunted, but whatever the truth, no one ever dared to stay there long. Jamie, Kelly, and Mark never spoke of that summer again. But even years later, Jamie would sometimes wake in the dead of night, hearing those same footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming down the hall. And she knew that no matter how far she ran, something had followed them home, patiently waiting, watching from the darkness. The villagers of Ravensbrook had long whispered about the Mirror Man, a sinister figure who, legend had it, could be summoned under specific chilling circumstances. No one was quite sure when or how the story began, only that it was as old as the village itself. For centuries, children were warned never to look into a mirror at night, especially not alone. But every few generations, a skeptic would test the legend, almost always disappearing soon after, leaving no trace behind. Lucy had heard the stories since she was young. She'd grown up in Ravensbrook, a quiet, fog-laden village tucked into the hills, and like most of her friends, thought the tales were nothing more than superstitions designed to scare them into behaving. But that changed the night she dared to put the legend to the test. Her friend Daniel had gone missing a month earlier, vanishing without a word or clue, and she was desperate for answers. The police had searched everywhere, scouring the woods and lakes nearby, but Daniel was nowhere to be found. His disappearance gnawed at her, the mystery of it consuming her thoughts day and night. One evening, she and a small group of friends gathered in her living room, determined to find out the truth. The legend, as they knew it, was simple. To summon the Mirror Man, you had to be alone at midnight in front of a mirror. You had to stare into your own reflection and, without breaking eye contact, whisper 3 times, "Mirror Man, show me what you've taken." As the final words left your lips, it was said he would appear just behind you, his face so close you'd feel his breath on your neck. But you couldn't look directly at him. If you did, he would take you, just as he had taken Daniel and countless others before. Lucy was skeptical but determined. She felt she owed it to Daniel to confront whatever force had taken him. Her friends were less sure. They begged her to let it go, but Lucy was firm. When midnight came, she went upstairs, closing herself in the bathroom with only a candle to light the mirror's reflection. The room was quiet, her reflection flickering in the candlelight, eyes wide and anxious. She took a deep breath, her pulse loud in her ears. Her friends waited downstairs, promising to come in if she didn't return within 5 minutes. Lucy closed her eyes, counting down until the clock struck 12, then opened them, locking her gaze onto her own reflection. Her face looked back at her, unnervingly still. She whispered, "Mirror Man, show me what you've taken." Nothing happened. Her reflection stared back, expressionless. "Mirror Man, show me what you've taken," she repeated, her voice softer this time, a nervous tremor creeping in. The silence felt thick, stretching around her, pressing in like the walls were closing. She could feel her heart pounding, each beat echoing in her chest. Still, nothing happened. Finally, she spoke the words a 3rd time, barely able to keep her gaze steady. "Mirror Man, show me what you've taken." There was a pause, long and oppressive, and just as she began to think it had all been for nothing, the candlelight in the room dimmed. Her reflection seemed to grow darker, as though a shadow had fallen over her face. Her reflection's eyes shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly, moving just out of sync with her own, as if it had a life of its own. A soft, cold whisper drifted into her ear, chilling her to the bone. "You called me." She froze, her skin crawling as an overwhelming sense of dread filled her. In the mirror, her reflection's eyes darkened, becoming empty, soulless pits. She saw something move in the background, just behind her left shoulder. A faint, pale shape, barely visible, was shifting, stepping closer. Lucy held her breath, trying not to break her gaze, but the figure's form began to grow clearer. He was tall, unnaturally thin, his limbs stretching at wrong angles, his head tilted with a vacant smile. She could feel his presence, ice cold, just behind her, so close she could swear she felt his breath on her neck. "Look at me," he whispered, his voice dripping with malice. "I know what you want to see." Her hands clenched the edge of the sink as she resisted the urge to turn. She could feel his fingers almost grazing her shoulder, cold as death. She could smell the faint scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something metallic, like blood. He leaned closer, his mouth inches from her ear. "He didn't scream," he said, the words laced with a sickening, gleeful satisfaction. "Do you want to see where he is?" Lucy felt tears prick her eyes, her mind racing with horror. She fought to keep her gaze locked on her reflection, ignoring the urge to turn and look at him, to demand answers, to find Daniel. But she knew if she turned, she'd never escape. She'd be another whisper in the village, another name lost to the Mirror Man. Suddenly, her reflection grinned, a twisted, unnatural expression as though it were a puppet controlled by invisible strings. The reflection mouthed something she couldn't hear, but she could read the words on its lips. "I'm waiting for you, Lucy." Then, in an instant, the room snapped back to normal. The shadows vanished, her reflection returned to its usual self, wide-eyed and horrified. She stumbled back, clutching her chest as the candle flickered violently, struggling to stay lit. Downstairs, her friends heard her scream and came running, bursting into the bathroom. They found her pale and trembling, unable to speak, her eyes wide and filled with terror. She tried to explain what she'd seen, what she'd heard, but they could only stare in disbelief, unsure whether to believe her or chalk it up to fear. The next day, she and her friends decided to leave the village for good, leaving the house and the mirrors behind. But the experience haunted her. She never spoke of the mirror man again, but each night as she drifted off to sleep, she could feel his gaze on her, as if watching from somewhere just beyond sight. And sometimes in darkened windows and reflective surfaces, she'd catch a glimpse of that familiar twisted smile, watching, waiting, whispering her name. And she knew deep down that the mirror man never really let go of his victims. He was patient, biding his time, waiting for the day she'd finally look back and join the others trapped forever in the darkness of his reflection.